Hello, everyone. We are here with our next amazing author. And this book by Alissa Butterworth is To Die is Different Than Supposed. So, kind of even just the title makes you think a lot, right? And so, it's just an amazing book. And so, I'm so happy to have Alissa here with us today. And Alissa, I would like for you to just kind of share with the audience what inspired you to write this book. And as you do that, I'm going to go and put your Amazon link into the comments.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me too, was the first thing I wanted to say. Regarding what inspired me to write the book, it really was the characters. That's where I tend to start when I write anything, is characters kind of start talking to me, revealing the things they care about, the things that matter to them, the things that don't. And so from there, this novel has five narrators, so it's five perspectives, different revolving as the book goes on. And so the dialogue between the characters was really important, and kind of seeing how they interact together, and then it just sort of spun out from there, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And this session we're featured a lot on dystopian fiction, apocalyptic, speculative, etc. And some people might be like, okay, how did Alyssa's book work its way into this? And so we had a talk earlier with Seema, and she had a wonderful talk about her book, Mama Black Sheep. And if you look at these stories about families, there's a real dystopian aspect to these families, right? And there's this kind of facade that we see of families and how
Sure.
a lot of times families are like perfect and together. But then when you
Mhm.
pull the thread, and I think particularly in this family of the Gable family, you could see where they were on this kind of everything's great, but then like when you pull things back, this is not great. There's like real issues going on there. So can you describe that a little bit, like the friction points and how you were able to capture those without giving us too many spoilers?
Sure. So, the Gable family, they're like every family and unlike every family in the way that families are all similar and all different. And the novel has two parallel storylines. There's the present, which is 2016, and then there's the past, which takes place 20 years before that. And the family is really rocked by two sets of tragedies, one that takes place 20 years before the present in 1996, and then with the death of their father, who's really not a very nice guy. And if there's a villain in the book, it's really him. And so the friction points come, both from what's happening in the present with all of the adult siblings and their teenage half brother who have to return home to bury their father, and sort of dealing with all those things that you would expect, when you lose a parent, you have to kind of figure out what comes next. But there's also this reckoning with their past, which was not a good one. And for a variety of characters in a variety of ways, their past really shapes their present. And I think that that sort of parallel between a family that can in itself be sort of dystopian as astute observation about it, just in the sense that, like every family has a series of systems and beliefs and a culture, let's say. And the Gable family culture might look one way from the outside, but it's very different from within. And the thing that I enjoyed sort of exploring was how that family culture is different from the perspective of different siblings. The oldest son has a very different perspective on things than the only sister or the younger half brother. And so watching those characters sort of reckon with the fact that their own past isn't the past that their siblings lived through, even though they were all going through it at the same time, was kind of interesting, and also a little bit of a mind bending thing for me.
I think that's a super important point. It's like we all look at things through different perspective, and so we can all see the same thing, and then we all walk away with like, "Oh, that was great," and you're like, "No, that was terrible," and it's like, "No, like we just went through the same thing. Like, how is it so vastly different?" And I
Sure.
think that that's a great aspect of this. And I want to touch on you have a little bit of supernatural in here with Ella. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So in the novel, there is a ghost. It's not a horror novel, though. I call it a ghost story because there is a ghost, and there's, haunting is very present and on the page. But it's not perhaps the kind of haunting that you expect when you hear of a story that has a ghost in it. The ghost is different things to different characters, but mostly he is a comforting presence. And I don't think it gives too much away to say that the ghost is one of the other Gable siblings who died in childhood. So back in 1996, in the past storyline, one of the five siblings, so there originally would have been six, was killed in a car accident. And so his ghost is a very active participant in the story, not a first person narrative perspective, but still an active participant. And so this element of the supernatural, I think, also links pretty heavily to a lot of the speculative work that you've been talking to other authors about today so far.
Yeah, and I think that kind of bending your mind to accept different aspects of reality is super important concept in there. Is the way I see things and you see things, well, you see a ghost. So that's an entirely different thing. And just being open to this kind of concept.
Yeah, and I think being open to the concept and being open in general is really one of the strong themes that I work with in the novel, in the sense, especially that, the ghost appears to different siblings in different ways. And for some of them, he's a comforting presence who's been there forever, which is in the case of Ella, the only sister. The opening chapter of the book is the ghost returning to her. And, this is something that for a long time for her was comforting. And he comes with a message and a warning that's a little alarming to her, which is sort of what makes the inciting incident of the novel kick off. But, to other siblings, he is a shadow, or he can't reach them at all. And so the way that he connects with different characters strongly reflects the way that they have dealt with their own grief and their own trauma. And in coming together with the ghost and with each other is kind of the way through this sort of dystopian atmosphere that their father kind of created for them.
Great concepts. I have your book right here, and I'm really, really excited. I'm going to go ahead and open this up to a passage.
Sure, please do.
And then after I read this out, I would love to just get your thoughts. Like, what were you thinking when you write it? And then what do you want readers to feel? Okay, I'm dozing when mom's phone goes off. It sings out an annoying short version of an Adele song. Mom got it as a free download from a little card they gave out at Starbucks. She doesn't move and the phone keeps ringing. Finally, I roll over, get up, and go rummaging in her purse for the phone. She lies there, her mouth slack and cheeks puffing slightly as she breathes. She almost looks dead herself. I find the phone and go back to my bed. She's missed 5 calls, 3 of which came in the last few minutes. I recognize the area code first, one from home. Mrs. Gable, the guy says when I accept his 6th attempt. Mrs. Emily Gable, this is Roger Sherm from the Sherm funeral. You want my mom, I say, trying to make my voice sound deeper. I don't know why I do it, except I feel like playing with the guy some. He's calling from the funeral home, aid used in Sawtell. I remember the name of the place. Who might I be speaking to? He asked, his voice tinny. This is Calvin Gable, I say. My mother can't talk. We're waiting for our plane. We're not waiting for the plane, obviously, but he doesn't know that. He coughs and clears his throat a little. I'm sorry for your loss, son, he says, but it's imperative I speak to someone in your family regarding the obituary. I hate when people who aren't my parents call me that. I'm not his son. Do you know what time it is? I say, trying to sound angry. Yes, it's 5 o'clock, sir, Roger answers. Do you habitually barge in on grieving families? I don't know where the words come from, but they make me smile. May I please speak to your mother? He asks, trying to wrestle control of the conversation from me. I feel it coming through the line. I look over at Mom, the way she's curled into herself, like the plaster cast they made of dead bodies in Pompeii. I saw those in real life. We took a trip to Italy when I was 9. She can't come to the phone, I say. Is there someone else I can speak to, Calvin? Your brother Adrian. I'm so sorry to bother you, but no, he's not here either. Ah, Roger Sherm says. Then he doesn't say anything, like he's waiting for me to fix some problem for him. When I read that, I was like, this kid is like, no, like I'm taking care of Mom, which is a lot of role reversal there and very protective. And then this whole piece of Pompeii and just how evocative of this and the symbolisms of death, which is very consistent through your book. And so let you talk and share what were your thoughts when you wrote it, and also what do you want readers to feel when they read it?
Sure. So, I do you mean when I wrote that particular chapter or the book in general?
Whichever you want.
Whichever. Okay. So
Lots of options. There's nothing prescriptive here. You're the author.
Right,
You're in charge.
Sure. That chapter in particular is narrated by Calvin, who is the younger half brother of the other adult four narrators. And he's in a position where his father has died, and he finds out that his father wants to be buried back on the East Coast in Pennsylvania, where his original family had grown up. And so Calvin and his mother are really thrown into this very strange position of being the second family of James, the father who died. And Calvin's experience of his father has been really very different than his older siblings. But, now that he's not only lost his father, he's sort of walking into this legacy of this inherited trauma from his older siblings who have a lot of baggage to do with their dad. And so what's happening in that chapter is, there's little hints, that Calvin's life has been very different than the older Gables. His parents take him to Pompeii, to Italy when he's 9, which is something that never would have happened to his older siblings. There were 5 kids and then 4 after the accident. But, there was never money to do those sorts of things. And so Calvin, I think, is starting to understand maybe the privilege that he grew up with, but also I think as the novel goes on, he starts to realize that he's also at a disadvantage because he hasn't had connections with these siblings. And so in this particular chapter 2, his mom, Emily, is becoming increasingly disengaged with what's happening. And Calvin, for better or worse, feels the need to step up and to sort of parent her, for lack of a better phrase. And so that's kind of what was happening in this chapter. And then the larger work, as far as death and trauma and grief and how all those things play together. You had mentioned, like sort of what do I hope readers experience or talk about or think about or feel when they read the novel? And a large part of it is, how do we grieve? How do we move through an experience that's very personal and perhaps even very primitive? Grief is one of those really raw, deep base emotions, I feel. And for a long time, this particular family has been very isolated. They're all sort of estranged from each other, maybe even estranged from their own past. And so the idea too that you can die without dying, if that makes any sense, was one that I was playing with in this book a lot. And there's a quote on the back of the book that says, "We died by bicycle, we died by a breakfast gone bad," whatever. Don't have the quote quite memorized. But it speaks to this idea that death is not, just a physical end, but that it can be an emotional end. It can be the end of what you thought of as your family. It can be the end of a relationship. And throughout the book, really, I think one of the central through lines is how each character deals with those small deaths that we all go through as we get older, we age. And even the title, "To Die is Different Than Supposed," it comes from Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. There's one section of that, and it starts, "The child asks, what is the grass?" So it's this little poem. And the quote from that is, "To die is different from what anyone supposed and luckier." And so that idea that dying in itself, maybe not is a good thing, but is something that has benefit to us in some way, is different than we suppose, is an idea that really, I think, permeates the book. And I would say too that I want my readers to consider what is a haunting. How does the supernatural maybe become not something that's separate from us, but that's something that's so close and becomes sort of a focusing agent for your relationships, for your experiences. And so those are the sort of things that I kind of have playing in the background. I mean, I also just want readers to enjoy the book and feel moved by
it. Yeah, speaking of that, I'm going to put a whole bunch of your social clips in here right now for anybody who wants to reach out. One of the things I highly advise people to do is go to the author sites and go ahead, get the newsletters, find out what's coming out next. And you just brought up a really good point that I do want to point out to authors is buy the book and write a review. Reviews are so incredibly important. I feel terrible for all the reviews I never left as a reader until I became an author, because I had no idea how important it is. So, like, you can love this book and you can just be like, oh my God, this is like one of the greatest books I ever read. How do people not know about it? If you don't leave a review, nobody will know. It is like literally a tree fell in the woods.
100% agree with you. And I think, just as you said, until you have a book out there, or folks who have a book out there and you see it from sort of the author side, it's hard to realize that reviews matter and count, and those algorithms that are out there are really kind of shaping what readers see and what we encounter. And so the more reviews folks leave, really for good or bad, it still helps sort of push that needle in the direction that authors hope it goes in.
And so definitely, if you find this like lyrical, beautiful, if you want to kind of just explore this dystopia of family, this dystopia of death, it is, I think, something so profound. And that's why I loved including a couple books where you're looking at dystopia, not on a huge societal collapse level, but we often feel this sense of, why am I not feeling connected to the bigger thing? And a book like this can give you that kind of concept, of a way to think about, why do I feel alone in a room full of people?
That phrase, alone in a room full of people, is, I think, something that each of my characters contend with in their own way. Or, why do I feel alone when I'm surrounded by my siblings and the people who love me? And I feel like that's a very
closer connection to the paranormal than I am to the people actually physically in the room in this case.
Right.
So you have a lot going on here. One of the things I wanted to ask you is what is the future? Where are you going? These are the kind of things that authors love to share in their newsletters and on interviews.
Sure. So, I think right now for me, I'm doing a lot of sort of generative work. I have two different projects in mind that I'm sort of moving towards. One is organizing my first short story collection. I've written a lot of short fiction over the years. This is my debut novel. And so kind of organizing those stories, and, some of them have very speculative elements. Some are straight up fantasy pieces. A lot of what I write, though, tends to have this sort of supernatural element. Maybe it's a ghost or an urban legend. Again, not scary, more, somebody described it as like Dickensian ghosts, which makes sense. Like if you think about like the ghosts that visit Scrooge, they're not necessarily to scare, they're more to illuminate. And that's kind of the space I write in. So anyway, that there's a short story collection, and then I'm also just really sort of noodling on the idea of another novel that is a little bit more of like a traditional haunted house setup, but it's very early in the stages for that one. But I'm not quite sure which project takes precedence at this point.
So that's awesome. And let's talk a little bit about your writing process. And so I love to find this out from authors. I think readers love to find this part out too, right? It's kind of like, do you kind of plan it out? Do you storyboard it? Do you do this part? Do you kind of pants it, go by your seat of pants? Or do you kind of like do some hybrid approach?
One thing I will say is I also am fascinated by process. Mason Curry's Daily Rituals is a fantastic book about the processes of all sorts of creative individuals, composers, writers, artists, everybody in between. So I always recommend that when I talk about process. So for me, drafting is a very organic process. Yeah, I don't sit down. I don't have a set word count that I work to in a particular day. It's pretty organic. Revising and editing, though, is much more structured. That for me is sessions are usually, they go about an hour. Otherwise, I start to run out of steam, and they're very focused, where I'm going to work on a particular chapter or scene, and I'm looking at certain craft elements. And so it really, my process depends on what stage of the writing process I'm at. And I try my best to write efficiently, and that's not always easy. Life gets in the way, but I try. So go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, this is your interview, and I love that you're sharing this. I just think it's such an important concept, like you said. It's sort of like the writing process happens, and it is when you have to write something like, I've got to write this blog post, is so intimidating sometimes. And so the writing process, like you mentioned, it kind of flows. So it's kind of what happens.
Yep. You know, for me too, the writing process shifts depending on what I'm working on. So if I'm writing an article or a blog post or something, or even a piece of short fiction, it's a very different way of approaching it than if it's a longer term piece, something book length or like novella length, I'll say. Just the way that I approach it, everything is generally stretched out for a longer work, but it's a bit of a different mindset.
No, and different. Every author has a different way of approaching it.
Yeah.
Let's talk real quick about how does your personal experiences influence your themes in your writing?
Sure. So luckily for me, I've never experienced any of the deep trauma that my characters have. I always try to lead with that because people always assume that, you know, the things that happen in your book have happened to you. And blessedly, that's not the case for me or my family, and I'm grateful for that. But a lot of the settings really are similar to places where I grew up. The town that the Gables grew up in and then returned to is a fictionalized version of the town I grew up in. Their house that they grew up in there's elements of it, you know, from my grandmother's backyard, places that are very familiar to me. There's also a chapter in the book in which the family goes to a cemetery to watch the 4th of July fireworks because it's the best place to watch. And then the kids are out and, you know, playing in the graveyard and there's a chain coming out of a grave and they yank on it. And that actually did happen to me. We did go one summer to watch the 4th of July fireworks with friends, and there was a chain that came out of a grave. To this day, I don't know what it was about or why it was there, but it's one of those things that, you know, you're 10 or 11 years old and it sticks with you for decades. And so it ended up in the book. So yeah, it's things like that. You know, it's a little bit more setting based, experience based. I think too that, you know, some of what my characters experience is based on stories I've heard, larger extended family things that have happened, but it's not strictly derivative, if that makes sense. I've also always been interested in. I was just gonna say I've always been interested in ghost stories, things like that. I was always the kid who wanted to like go on the ghost historical walking tour in a city. So those sorts of topics have always interested me. And so, you know, the fact that that showed up in this otherwise realistic book makes sense, at least from my perspective.
And like I said, I think that definitely the paranormal aspect gives it much more of that dystopian aspect than if it was just a straight like novel that didn't have that paranormal ghost sort of and the 20-year aspect to it definitely adds a lot to it, where you're seeing the 1996 versus the 2016. So what I want to do is just give a quick shout out to thank you for being here for 24 authors in 12 hours. I really appreciate all the authors, and this is an author helping author event. If you want to donate, we love donations. But if not, that is fine too. I also want to do a shameless plug for our merchandise. We have coffee mugs, we have water bottles, etc. And it's a great way to just show your support for authors and the author helping author community. And then I am also doing one last shameless plug for my own book, which is called Decoding History, The Invisible Thread. This is a speculative fiction book based on the year 2055. It's based 30 years after the Librarian of Congress was fired from her email. The National Archivist has been fired. And it's really looking at this future where data has been erased. Information is difficult to find. The Native American Museum has now been turned into a brothel, which ironically there was originally a brothel there before they built the Native American Museum. So super kind of interesting historical fact there. And so now prostitution is legal again. And so you're in a future where history is controlled and you're trying to figure out what has happened in this time frame and what has led to this kind of world where, you know, it's kind of the Handmaid's Tale kind of dystopia of what's going on. One of my beta readers described it as Jane Austen meets dystopia, which is sort of, I think, a cool vibe to it. And so I love that description. And I was like, yeah, that's kind of like where you're really going. So for any of the readers, if you want to check this out, it is available today for Kindle download, absolutely free. It's also always available Kindle Unlimited for free. And once again, if you want to read any of the authors, highly, highly advise every single one of these amazing books that you can purchase in paperback. You can purchase in hardbacks in some cases, Kindle, audiobooks a lot of people have, but encourage you, do those reviews. You don't realize how important those reviews are until you become an author. And with this, I want to look over to Alissa as we are wrapping up this segment for any last anything we didn't cover that you wanted to mention or anything you want to add.
I think just the thing that I always tell folks is, that stories matter and your story matters. And so I feel strongly that everybody has the right to tell their story the best way they know how. And so I always encourage anybody who I'm talking to about creative writing, books, reading, just to keep that in mind and that your voice matters, your story matters, and, you should find the way to write it and get it out there. I think that's everything.
Thank you so much. And we'll be back in just a few minutes with our next author.